Good afternoon. We are the Honors Oxbridge of Flannery O'Connor, and we are presenting one of her short stories, Revelation. And in this, all of us students who have been researching here for the past year will present what our chapters are about throughout the speech. And just as a disclaimer, this is a story about a racist Southern lady from the 1950s, and there will be language from that time, period. Thank you and enjoy.
Revelation, an adaptation of the short story by Flannery O'Connor. The doctor's waiting room, which was very small, was almost full when the Turpins entered. Mrs. Turpin, who was very large, made it look even smaller by her presence. Her little bright black eyes took in all the patients as she sized up the seating situation. There was one vacant chair and a place on the sofa occupied by a blonde child in a dirty blue romper, who should have been told to move over or make room for the lady. He was 5 or 6, but Mrs. Turpin saw at once that no one was going to tell him to move over. He was slumped down in his seat, his arms idle at his sides, and his eyes idle in his head. His nose ran unchecked.
Flannery O'Connor is not sentimental about children. In one of her speeches in the book Mystery of Manners, she notes that sentimentality is inexcusable for Christians, presumably because they know the sin that is in the heart of men. O'Connor has 3 main motifs when depicting characters in her stories: the innocent, the dull, and the wicked. Each of these types is meant to show us aspects of ourselves, children in the eyes of God, always vulnerable, innately trusting, sometimes numb with shock at the evil of the world, and sometimes playing with evil and wickedness like children play with fire. Generally, O'Connor's children are tragic and neglected, and it hurts to read about them. But in the end, their sufferings hold redemptive power and healing. Often O'Connor will pull our attention back to the dull children by having them do something completely socially inadequate. In Revelation, it's this little boy who is unconscious of the adult women who need to see. He is unconscious of his runny nose and swallowed clothes. This is an example of O'Connor's use of the grotesque to bring our attention to what she wants us to notice and ask ourselves. What makes a child so burrowed down in themselves that they barely notice the world around them? Why doesn't someone teach him better manners? Why doesn't his mother wipe his nose? We absorb that there is some serious neglect in this child's life, and that he has found his own way to cope and even to survive by pretending there is no hurt, or there is no him there to hurt. The reason over and over in O'Connor's for the dull children seems to come down to grief. Basically, these children are mourning their own childhoods. Invariably, they are missing one parent or another, or in the case here in Revelation, missing a real grown-up, mature parent. As a victim of neglect, O'Connor's children only have a vague sense of what exactly they are missing, which confusion only adds more to the outward mask of dullness. Their dullness is a developed coping mechanism as they are unable to handle their own grief and sorrow and are consistently being rejected and rebuked for it by AWOL parents. O'Connor's dull kids have suffered a loss of innocence and have learned to protect themselves from their shock at the wrongness of the world. O'Connor wants us to be uncomfortably aware that protecting their children is the very job of their parents. When we are not aware what we are meant to be, the repercussions of that can be seen in those around us. A child's dullness for O'Connor is a direct result of his parents' neglect and a lack of empathy. The truth is, all of us are O'Connor's dull kids, and that we are all still recovering from the loss of our own innocence, the first time we encountered the unfathomably insanity of evil. We have all assumed a kind of dullness, bravado, cynicism, distance, as a way of masking our grief, the fundamental, inescapable grief of knowing in our core that we are children who are alienated from our Father in heaven.
Mrs. Turpin put a firm hand on Claude's shoulder. and said in a voice that included anyone who wanted to listen,
Claude, you sit in that chair there.
She gave him a push down into the vacant chair. Claude was florid and bald and sturdy, somewhat shorter than Mrs. Turpin, but he sat down as if he were accustomed to doing what she told him to. Mrs. Turpin remained standing. The only man in the room beside Claude was a lean, stringy old fellow with a rusty hand spread out on each knee, whose eyes were closed as if he were asleep, or dead, or pretending to be so as not to get up and offer her his seat. Mrs. Turpin's gaze settled agreeably on a well-dressed, gray-haired lady whose eyes met hers and whose expression said, if that child belonged to me, he'd have some manners and move over. Claude sighed and made as if to rise.
Sit down, Claude. You know you're not supposed to stand on that leg. He has an ulcer on his leg.
Alright, hold up. Does this story already sound a bit odd to you? If so, good. This is how an O'Connor story should make you feel. In my chapter, I look at the families in O'Connor's short stories, why she uses them, and how they should affect us. Revelation is one of the best introductions to O'Connor's dysfunctional families. Within the first 2 pages are a married couple with no children, the Turpins, a lower-class family, the white trash family, and a single-parent family, the pleasant lady and the girl. Out of O'Connor's 29 short stories, only 2 of these stories include a nuclear family, with both parents and a child. She uses these families partly because she herself was part of a dysfunctional family, but she also uses them without any context as to why they aren't nuclear, because she wants you to feel that something might be off. She wants you to judge these families against your own, because your family can't be that broken or dysfunctional, right? The first thing that you see about the Turpins here is that they are a dysfunctional family, but not quite in the traditional sense, especially in the era when O'Connor is writing her stories. For that time period, it's not only odd that the wife is the dominant person in the marriage, but also that Mrs. Turpin treats her husband Claude almost like a child. This is how Mrs. Turpin both treats and sees those around her, as dumb children who are not aware of the truth and need to be told what to do. O'Connor uses this dysfunctional relationship as a red flag in this story. We feel that something's not quite right with the Turpins.
Claude lifted his foot onto the magazine table, rolled his trouser leg up to reveal a purple swelling on a plump marked white calf. My, the pleasant lady said. How'd you do that?
A cow kicked her.
Goodness, said the lady. Claude rolled his trouser leg down. Maybe the little boy would move over, the lady suggested, but the child did not stir.
That's okay, I'll stand. Somebody will be leaving in a minute. I cannot for the life of me understand why a doctor who makes as much money as he does, charging $5 a day just to stick your head into the hospital door and look at you, cannot afford a decent-sized waiting room.
The room was hardly bigger than a garage. The table was cluttered with limp-looking magazines, and at one end of it, there was a big green glass ashtray full of cigarette butts and cotton wads with little blood spots on them.
If I had anything to do with running this place, those would be emptied every so often.
At the head of the room was a rectangular-shaped window that permitted a view of the office where the nurse came and went, and the secretary listened to the radio. The radio was softly playing gospel music. Just then, the inner door opened, and a nurse with the highest stack of yellow hair Mrs. Turpin had ever seen put her face in the crack and called for the next patient. The woman sitting beside Claude grasped the 2 arms of her chair, hoisted herself up. She pulled her dress free from her legs and lumbered through the door.
Oh, I wish I could produce.
Oh, you aren't fat, the stylish lady said.
Oh, I am too. My Claude, he eats whatever he wants to and never gains anything over 175 pounds. But me, I just look at something good to eat and I gain weight. You can eat whatever you want to, can't you, Claude?
Claude only grinned.
Well, but you have such a good disposition,
The stylish lady said.
It don't make one bit of difference what size you are as long as you have a good disposition.
Next to her was a fat girl of 18 or 19, scowling into a thick blue book which Mrs. Turpin saw was entitled Human Development. The girl raised her head and directed her scowl at Mrs. Turpin as if she did not like her looks. She appeared annoyed that anyone should speak while she tried to read. The poor girl's face was blue with acne.
It's just pitiful to have a face like that at that age.
She gave the girl a friendly smile, but the girl only scowled the harder.
Well, it might be true that I'm fat, but I've always had good skin. I might be 47 years of age, but there is not a wrinkle on my face. Except around my eyes. But that comes from laughing so much.
Next to the ugly girl was the child, still in exactly the same position, and next to him was a thin, leathery old woman in a cotton print dress.
Me and Claude had 3 sacks of chicken feed in our pump house that was in the exact same print. I seen from the first that that child belonged to that old woman. You could tell by the way they sat, kind of vacant and white trashy. They'd sit there until doomsday if nobody called and told them to get up.
The child's mother had on a yellow sweatshirt and wine-colored slacks, both gritty looking, and the rims of her lips were stained with snuff. Her dirty yellow hair was tied behind with a little piece of red paper ribbon.
White trash is the worst people there is.
The gospel hymn was playing, When I Looked Up and He Looked Down, and Mrs. Turpin, who knew it, supplied the last line mentally.
And one of these days I know I'll wear a crown.
Without appearing to, Mrs. Turpin always noticed people's feet. The well-dressed lady had on red and gray suede shoes to match her dress. Mrs. Turpin had on her good black patent leather pumps. The ugly girl had on Girl Scout shoes and heavy socks. The old woman had on tennis shoes. And the white trashy mother had on what appeared to be bedroom slippers, black straw with gold braid threaded through them.
Exactly what you would have expected her to have on.
So I want to take this moment to talk about my topic in my chapter, which is elderly people within O'Connor's short stories. So at this point, we're pretty familiar with Mrs. Turpin. Her thoughts focus on her judgments of her surroundings. For example, she disapproves of the doctor's waiting room, thinking to herself how much better she could do if she were running the place. And she only sees the girl across from her for her scowl, her weight, and her acne, thinking to herself how blessed she is to have good skin at her age. And she elevates her ego by noticing every negative detail about every person in the room. For example, the chicken feed dress on the thin, leathery woman, the white trash, the woman with the lank face, and every worn pair of shoes on each person's foot. So she really has an inflated view of herself, and she's only to admit one flaw, her weight. She sees the other white people in the room and deems them white trash, thinking she's above it. Her identity exists within this very rigid hierarchy in which she has the last to say about everybody else. And her world revolves around the idea of what a respectable person is, and she's unable to see people for who they truly are. So this is a really common trait found in many of O'Connor's elderly characters. Like Mrs. Turpin, these characters have long-held notions of their place in the world and the places of those around them. And some of these common traits include self-absorption, pride, and overt racism. They live in a world where they are their own god. And it's really normal at this point, when reading O'Connor stories or hearing it like we are today, to be very repulsed by this exaggerated personification of an elderly person. You see, O'Connor presents us with these characters to start us thinking in our own minds. And after getting to know Mrs. Turpin in the short span of a few lines, we can say, we know a Mrs. Turpin. You know, someone who's self-absorbed, judgmental, and set in their ways. And so by nudging us on this train of thought of understanding other people around us, she wants us to now turn this train of thought onto ourselves. And isn't Mrs. Turpin all of us? I mean, I'm judgmental and self-absorbed, and I'm set in my ways a lot of the time. So haven't we all made these callous snap judgments about people in our own lives? And don't we all hold biases and have some sort of hierarchy decided in our minds? You know, in this way, O'Connor's elderly characters are incredibly significant because they present us with an exaggerated view of human nature, and they begin us questioning our own selves in the process.
Sometimes at night, when she couldn't go to sleep, Mrs. Turpin would occupy herself with the question of who she would have chosen to be if she couldn't have been herself. If Jesus had said to her before he made her, "There's only 2 places available for you. You can either be colored or white trash. What would she have said?
Please, Jesus, please. Just let me wait until there's another place available.
And Jesus would have said, no, you have to go right now, and I only have those 2 places, so make up your mind. She would have wiggled and squirmed and begged and pleaded, but it would have been no use, and finally she would have said,
All right. Just make me colored then, but that don't mean a trashy one.
Sometimes Mrs. Turpin occupied herself at night naming the classes of people.
On the bottom of the heap are most colored folks. Not the kind I would have been if I was one, but most. Then next to them, not above, just away from, are the white trash. Then above them are the people who own their own homes. Above them are the home and landowners, like Claude and me. And above us are the people with a lot of money and much bigger houses and much more land. But here's where it gets a little muddled, because the honest to heaven truth is that some people with a lot of money are truly common and ought to be below Claude and me. And some people with good blood have lost their money and had to rent. And of course, there are some colored people who own their own homes and lands as well. In fact, right there in town, there's a colored dentist who has 2 red Lincolns and a swimming pool and a farm with registered white-faced cattle on it. Oh, well, that's a beautiful clock.
It was a big wall clock, the face encased in a brass sunburst.
Yes, it's very pretty, the stylish lady said agreeably. And right on the dot, too, she added, glancing at her watch.
The ugly girl beside her cast an eye upward at the clock, smirked, then looked directly at Mrs. Turpin, and smirked again. Then she returned her looks to her book.
That ugly girl's certainly that pretty lady's daughter, but nothing like her mama in disposition. They both have the same shaped face and the same blue eyes. But the mother's eyes, they have a pleasant sparkle. In the daughter's, don't they just smolder like hellfire? What if Jesus had said to me, all right, you could either be white trash, or a nigger, or ugly? What would I say? Well, I do feel pity in my heart for that girl, but it's one thing to be ugly, and another thing to act ugly.
The woman with the snuff-stained lips turned around in her chair and looked up at the clock. Then she turned back and appeared to look a little to the side of Mrs. Turpin. There was a cast in one of her eyes. You want to know where you can get you one of them there clocks? She asked in a loud voice.
No, I already have a nice clock. I needed to shut her down fast. When someone like her got a leg in the conversation, she'd be all over it.
You can get you one with green stamps, the woman said. That's mostly likely where he got his, and save you up enough, can get you most anything. I gotta make some jewelry.
I'd have got you a wash rag and some soap.
I get the contour sheets with mine,
the pleasant lady said. The girl slammed her book shut. She looked straight in front of her, directly through Mrs. Turpin and on through the yellow curtain and the plate glass window behind her. The girl's eyes seemed lit all of a sudden with a peculiar light, an unnatural light, like that of a road night sign gives.
Girl, I haven't done a thing to you, and I'm not going to sit here and take that from you. You must be in college. I see you reading that book there.
The girl pointedly did not answer. Her mother blushed at this rudeness.
The lady asked you a question, Mary Grace,
she said under her breath. I have ears, Mary Grace said. The poor mother blushed again.
Mary Grace goes to Wellesley College,
She explained. She twisted one of the buttons on her dress. In Massachusetts, she added with a grimace.
And in the summer, she just keeps right on studying, just reads all the time. A real bookworm. She's done real well at Wellesley. She's taken English and math and history and in psychology and social studies, and she rattled on, and I think it's too much. I think she ought to get out and have some fun.
The girl looked as if she would like to hurl them all through the plate glass window.
Alright, so this behavior by the daughter, by the college student, is exactly what my research is on. Though O'Connor does not delve into the heart issues and the sinful nature of intellectuals in this particular story, she does hint at it. Here, she hints that even in seeing this obnoxious behavior by the girl, we're wondering, why hasn't she done anything with this apparent education that she has? Flannery O'Connor is warning all of us as college students to be careful how we use our education, whether we use it to make us entitled, the girl, or practical. The young girl in our story may have a long list of studies, but it doesn't seem to have done her any good. She is miserable and lives her life judging people behind her books, the symbol of what has given her this arrogance. The mother's comment that she ought to get out and have more fun hits the nail right on the head with O'Connor. Essentially, the message is this: if you're using your education to judge others, miserable in your own life, and feasting off the faults of those around you, well, you're better off not going to college at all. Why not live having fun and remain lighthearted? Seems to be better off for your soul, O'Connor suggests. For the former has lost her soul, lusting in her heart for the death of those she's deemed ignorant. She has become the judge of the world around her, actually taking the place of the only one who can truly judge, God. While living without an esteemed college degree may not make you $1 million, you might just be happier, more fulfilled, and have quite a few more friends. All in all, Flannery O'Connor wants us to be careful not to let our knowledge become our idols. Ultimately, we need to remember our place in society and understand the core truth that we are not God, but in fact, His creation.
The pleasant lady said in a thin voice,
I think people with bad dispositions are to be more pitied than anyone on earth.
I thank the Lord He has blessed me with a good one. The day has never dawned that I couldn't find something to laugh at.
the girl made a loud, ugly noise through her teeth.
It never hurt anyone to smile. It just makes you feel better all over. If it's one thing I am, it's grateful. When I think who all I could have been besides myself and what all I got, a little of everything and a good disposition, I just feel like shouting, "Thank you, Jesus, for making everything the way it is. It could have been different. For starters, someone else could have gotten clawed. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Jesus, thank you." Oh!
The book struck her directly over her left eye. It struck almost at the same instant as she realized the girl was about to hurl it. Before she could utter a sound, the raw face came crashing over the table toward her, howling. Mrs. Turpin was knocked to the ground with Mary Grace on top of her. The girl's fingers sank like clamps into the soft flesh of her neck. She heard the mother cry out in cloud shout, "Whoa!" There was an instant when she was certain that she was about to be in an earthquake. All at once her vision narrowed, and she saw everything as if it were happening in a small, far-away room, or as if she were looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. The nurse ran in, then out, then in again. Then the gangling figure of the doctor rushed out of the inner room. Magazines flew this way and that as the table turned over.
At this moment, reality hits Mrs. Turpin like, well, a book flying across the room. Up to this point, we can gather that Mrs. Turpin is pretty blissfully unaware of her surroundings. From the moment she steps into the waiting room, she notices just enough about people to judge them, from their shoes to their anatomy. She goes as far as making up her own class order, taking it upon herself to define who is objectively ugly and beautiful. And we see the pinnacle of her self-delusion when she thanks God for making her the way she is. But before we easily write off Mrs. Turpin as that racist older aunt that we all know and avoid, O'Connor complicates our feelings by putting another judgmental person, said book thrower, in the story, one who struggles with a very different set of obstacles. Both characters are offset by their counterpart, but both take part in the same action. They are consumed by their own isolation. Mrs. Turpin grooms her judgmental thoughts while Mary Grace refuses to acknowledge any truth outside her studies. Both limit their sight of reality through their own murky and isolated glasses. Yet a violent act brings about an unexpected communion. When the book hits Mrs. Turpin and knocks off her glasses, she suddenly faces reality and sees herself for who she is. But why the violence? To this, O'Connor says, when you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal means of talking to it. But when you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. For someone with such foggy glasses like Mrs. Turpin, there needed to be a shocking moment to begin her redemption. And just as I was about to judge Mrs. Turpin for it, I thought about the many times I'm convinced by my own belief systems until they come crashing down. Today, violence isn't foreign to us. We're surrounded by explosions, shouting, nuclear armistice, Me Too, and protests, which might just sum up the last 24-hour news cycle. Yet O'Connor uses violent moments not for spectacle's sake, but to bring about a communion that just might be holy.
Mrs. Turpin's vision suddenly reversed itself, and she saw everything large instead of small. The eyes of the white, trashy woman were staring hugely at the floor. There the girl, held down on one side by the nurse and on the other by her mother, was wrenching and turning in their grasp. The doctor was kneeling astride her, trying to hold her arm down. He managed after a second to sink a long needle into it. Mrs. Turpin's gaze was drawn slowly downward to Mary Grace's churning face on the floor, which she could see over the doctor's shoulder. The girl's eyes stopped rolling and focused on her. Mrs. Turpin leaned forward until she was looking directly into the fierce, brilliant eyes. There was no doubt in her mind that the girl did know her, knew her in some intense and personal way, beyond time and place and condition.
What you got to say to me?
The girl raised her head, her gaze locked with Mrs. Turpin's. Go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog, she whispered. Her voice was low but clear. Her eyes burned for a moment as she saw with pleasure that her message had struck its target.
Okay, show of hands, and be honest here. How many of you have ever wanted to do that to somebody before? Yeah, okay. So how many of you actually did it? Yeah, okay, so on one hand, this girl is really like us, right? I mean, we share a lot of her judgments of other people, but then on the other hand, she's really unlike us in that she actually goes and does this crazy stuff. So mostly we keep our judgments in our head, but the girl, Mary Grace, is rude and violent and even freakish with these shocking purple eyes. And yet, she tells Mrs. Turpin exactly the truth that Mrs. Turpin needs to hear. So this girl is a great example of Flannery O'Connor's freakish characters. My chapter is about how, in general, O'Connor's freaks are crucial to the plot of her story. She uses them as prophets and even as representatives of Christ. They speak the truth to ignorant protagonists in ways that those protagonists just can't ignore. But of course, O'Connor could have used almost anyone to serve these kinds of roles. So why use a freak? Well, think about Mrs. Turpin and just how ignorant and hurtful she is. She doesn't really understand herself. I mean, clearly she thinks about her own pleasant disposition while also having these same judgmental thoughts that she's completely blind to. And she also doesn't understand the external world and the truth about other people because she has this really social hierarchy, she has this rigid social hierarchy that sometimes doesn't make sense when she thinks about it too much, but is still there nonetheless. So O'Connor has a lot to say about our inner and outer worlds. And in one nonfiction piece she wrote called Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction, O'Connor wrote, "Art requires a delicate adjustment of the outer and inner worlds in such a way that without changing their nature, they can be seen through each other. To know oneself is to know one's region, and it is also to know the world." And so what O'Connor's freakish characters are doing is they're taking these protagonists whose inner and outer worlds are they're out of alignment. They don't see themselves or the external world clearly. And through an encounter with truth, through an encounter with a freakish truth, these outer and inner worlds are sort of forced back into alignment so that the character can see themselves and their place in reality clearly, probably for the first time. And I think what O'Connor is really trying to do with her stories is she's trying to have the same effect on us. In our own ways, each of us are out of touch with ourselves, out of touch with reality. And O'Connor hopes to scare us, or shock us, or make us think. And she writes these stories with these haunting moments that stick with us, because what she wants to do is help us see reality clearly. So what are some ways that you're blind to yourself, or to the outside world? And what will you do about it? Thanks.
Mrs. Turpin sank back in her chair. After a moment, the girl's eyes closed and she turned her head wearily to the side. The doctor rose and handed the nurse the empty syringe. "Let's see that neck," he said in a jovial voice to Mrs. Turpin. He began to inspect her neck with his first 2 fingers. 2 little moon-shaped lines like pink fish bones were indented over her windpipe. There was the beginning of an angry red swelling above her eye. His finger passed over this also.
Leave me be.
The doctor was a thin, gray-haired man, given to pleasantries. "Go home and have yourself a vacation the rest of the day," he said, and patted her on the shoulder.
Quit you patting me.
The only sound in the room were the tremulous moans of the girl's mother, who continued to sit on the floor beside her daughter. Mrs. Turpin looked straight ahead at nothing. Presently the ambulance drew up, a long dark shadow behind the curtain. The attendants came in, set the stretcher down beside the girl, and lifted her expertly onto it, carried her out. The Turpins went home. As their pickup truck turned into their own dirt road and made the crest of the hill, Mrs. Turpin gripped the window ledge and looked out suspiciously. The land sloped gracefully down through a field dotted with lavender weeds, and at the start of the rise of their small yellow frame house, with its little flower bed spread out around it like a fancy apron, sat primly in its accustomed place between 2 giant hickory trees. She would not have been startled to see a burnt wound between 2 blackened chimneys.
I'm not a warthog from hell. I'm Ruby Turpin, a respectable, hard-working, church-going woman.
Mrs. Turpin squared her massive shoulders. Then she marched into the front of the house and out the side door and started down the road to the pig parlor. She had the look of a woman going single-handed, weaponless, into battle. The sun was a deep yellow now, like a harvest moon, and was riding westward very fast over the far tree line, as if it meant to catch the hogs before she did.
Flannery O'Connor uses the natural world to draw our attention away from ourselves and onto something greater. Because today, we can become so distracted by everything and anything. But when she describes the sun as the deep yellow, now like a harvest moon, she creates this vivid image in our mind that we can't help but to remember. When we close our eyes, we see this bright yellow. This is the way she draws you in. She brings the natural world up to make us look up and look out and look what's in front of us. It is in grave importance in today's world because we are so infused with looking at our phones and looking down that we very seldom ever look up. We feel our pockets vibrate when our phone's not even there. We are just always infused with looking down and never looking up. The more we begin to look up and see the world in front of us, the greater chance we have that we'll either see something or be someone that can help change the path of someone's life. By creating a world of looking up and focusing on the sun, the moon, and the rivers, O'Connor begins to create a world that we can see grace through and become that grace for someone. As she walks towards the hog pen to wash down the animal, that sun is that deep yellow. It is as if the sun is God, hoping to reveal to Mrs. Turpin the error of her ways before it's too late. God is trying to reach her to the hogs before Mrs. Turpin so that she can have the revelation she's been dying to have. In my chapter, I am writing on the natural world and how we can see the elements and symbols represent a different part of a Christian walk. Look up and look out.
The pig parlor was on a little knoll at the end of the lane that ran off from the side of the barn. It was a square of concrete as large as a small room with a board fence about 4 foot high around it. The concrete floors sloped slightly so that the hog wash could drain off into the trench. Claude was standing on the outside hosing down the floor inside. Mrs. Turpin climbed up beside him and glowered down at the hog's inside. There were 7 long-snouted, bristly shoats in it, tanned with liver-colored spots, and an old sow a few weeks from farrowing. She was lying on her side, grunting. The shoats were running about and shaking themselves like idiot children, their little slit eyes searching the floor for scraps. She had read that pigs were the most intelligent animal. She doubted it. They were supposed to be smarter than dogs. There had even been a pig astronaut. He'd performed his assignment perfectly, but died of a heart attack afterward because they left him in his electric suit, sitting upright throughout his examination, when, naturally, a hog should be on all fours, a running, a rootin', and a groaning. She yanked the hose away from Claude.
Give me that hose. Go into the house and get off that lake.
Mrs. Turpin stood on the side of the pen, holding the hose and pointing down the stream of water at the hindquarters of any shoat that looked as if it might try to lie down. When he had had time to get over the hill, she turned her head slightly and her wrathful eyes scanned the path. Claude was nowhere in sight. She turned back again, her shoulders rose, and she drew in her breath.
What do you send me a message like that for? How am I a hog and me both? How am I saved and from hell too?
Her free fist was knotted, and with the other she gripped the hose, blindly pointing the stream of water at the eye of the old sow, whose outraged squeal she did not hear.
Okay, how many people found that strange? Picture Mrs. Turpin spraying a bunch of pigs with a hose as they stand on this giant slab of cement. The floor is spotless. Mrs. Turpin makes a clear effort to make sure it's spotless, and yet the floor is still somehow housing this thing that's typically supposed to be dirty. O'Connor has an incredible knack for using distasteful characters to drive home a point that we might not have grasped otherwise. In my chapter, I examine how O'Connor uses animal symbolism and imagery to reveal the opinions about ourselves that we don't even realize we hold. In this story specifically, Mrs. Turpin is an incredibly self-righteous woman, as Jackie and a couple others told us in their presentations. She doesn't recognize her own sin, and instead reveres it. She thinks she's better than everyone else she comes into contact with. In much the same way, she washes off her pigs and keeps them in an overly clean place, proud of how she handles them, rather than acknowledging the fact that she herself was referred to as a warthog earlier in the story. She considers her pigs to be better than average pigs, but fails to recognize the important truth. They're all still pigs. We think it's ridiculous that Mrs. Turpin is this self-righteous and unaware, but really, how many times do we do that in our own lives? You don't wash your dishes but get mad when your roommate doesn't do hers. You hate when your mom doesn't pick up when you call her, but you take 3 days to text her back. You complain when people take your stuff without asking, but borrow your sister's shirt when she's not home because she won't mind. Criticize your best friend's dating choices while getting offended when they suggest that your relationship might not be the healthiest. If any of these sound like something you do, you're beginning to uncover exactly what O'Connor wants to show you by using the pigs. It's so much easier to see an obvious flaw in a creature that's dissociated from you than it is to see it within yourself.
Why me? There's no trash around here, black or white, that I haven't given to and break my back to the bone working and do for the church. And how am I a hog? Exactly how am I like them? There's plenty of trash there. It didn't have to be me. If you like trash better, go get yourself some trash. You could have made me trash. Or a nigger. If trash is what you wanted, why didn't you make me trash? I could quit working, take it easy, and be filthy, lounging around the sidewalk, spitting in these puddles, and have it all over my face. You better believe that I could be nasty.
In the deepening light, everything was taking on a mysterious hue. The pasture was growing a particularly glassy green, and the streak of the highway had turned lavender. She braced herself for a final assault, and this time her voice rolled out over the pasture.
Go on, call me a hog. Call me a hog again, from hell. Call me a warthog from hell. Put the bottom rail on top. Either way, there's still a top or bottom. Who do you think you are?
The color of everything, field and crimson sky, burned for a moment with a transparent intensity. The question carried over the pasture and across the highway and the cotton field and returned to her clearly, like an answer from beyond the wood. Mrs. Turpin stood there, her gaze fixed, all her muscles rigid, for 5 or 6 minutes. Then, like a monumental statue coming to life, she bent her head slowly and gazed, as if through the very heart of mystery, down into the pig parlor at the Hogs. They had all settled in one corner around the old sow, who was grunting softly. A red glow suffused them. Mrs. Turpin remained there with her gaze bent to them, as if she were absorbing some abysmal, life-giving knowledge. At last she lifted her head. She raised her hands from her side of the pen in a gesture hieratic and profound. A visionary light settled in her eyes.
Oh, sweet Jesus, I see a bridge.
It was a vast, swinging bridge extending upward from the earth to a field of living fire. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were tumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives, and bands of black folks in white robes, and battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once.
And there's me and Claude, and our friends from church.
She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they had always been for great order, common sense, and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. Yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces, even their virtues were being burned away. She lowered her hands and gripped the rail of the hog pen, her eyes small but fixed unblinkingly on what lay ahead. In a moment, the vision faded, but she remained where she was. At length, she got down and turned off the faucet, and in her slow way, on the darkening path, returned to the house.
You're probably asking yourself, what in the world just happened? I know I definitely was when I first read this story. I was shocked by the events that took place, and I wanted a nice, tidy resolution that solved all of my questions. But instead, Flannery O'Connor gives us this ending that leaves us feeling haunted and somewhat uneasy. The cliffhanger that we all just experienced is a critical Flannery O'Connor motif that she uses to tell her stories and that she uses as a messenger of God's grace. Mrs. Turpin's opportunity for grace comes when the acne-covered girl attacks her and calls her a hog. She gets called out and has this profound vision, but we don't ever get to see whether Mrs. Turpin actually changes her behavior and how she interacts with others. O'Connor's purpose in doing this is to lead us to what she calls our own personal dragon, or the sins and brokenness that we may not be aware of. We never see Mrs. Turpin's change in behavior, and O'Connor keeps this transformation a mystery and ends her stories with cliffhangers so that we, as the reader, are able to authentically enter the story and complete it ourselves. Mrs. Turpin's transformation may be incomplete, but we can certainly create our own in our lives. So moving forward, I want you to know how to best read Flannery O'Connor stories and get the most out of them. First, don't try and Google the answers to your questions like I did right away. Instead, allow them to haunt you and read the stories more than once. Think about them deeply. In typical O'Connor fashion, the way she describes the peacocks she raised her whole life is analogous to how she wants us to read her stories. She states, quote, "When it suits him, the peacock will face you. Then you will see that in a green bronze arch around him, a galaxy of gazing, hallowed suns. This is the moment when most people are silent. The meanings of her stories may not be initially apparent to us, but when her message is revealed, it leaves us in awe and in realization of our own brokenness. The revelation, like waiting to see the peacock's feathers, cannot be forced. It requires patience, time, and a willingness from the reader. O'Connor's stories are more than just for pure entertainment. They're designed to call us out on our brokenness and transform us. But we must allow them to do so with patience and deep reflection. And once we do that, I can tell you from my own experience, they will change our lives.
In woods around Ruby, the invisible cricket choruses had struck up. But what she heard were the voices of the souls climbing upward into the starry field and shouting, "Hallelujah." The end.